I just want to start by saying it's a real pleasure when you know that someone's written a book and the first thing you think is, that's a great subject. Actually, come to think of it, yes, very, very good question. So thank you for writing the book, and it didn't disappoint at all. So my first question really is, was there a particular person, was there a stable genius moment where you thought, hang on a second, what is this even, what does this word even mean?
Yeah, I've been trying, because people do ask me this a lot, and I just think I really should come up with a better story, and I can't remember what it was. It always seems mad in retrospect to try and go back. But one of the things I do remember happening is I've got a friend called Rob, who's one of the people the book is dedicated to, and he is a theatre director, and he had said once, offhand in an interview, of course, genius is a right-wing concept. And I thought that was really interesting. Can I tell you, this makes right-wing people bizarrely angry? You're like, but you like this. I don't know why. It makes you sad. But he had this idea that essentially, it's about privileging the individual over the collective. It's about, in some forms, the kind of great man theory of history, the idea that some people come along and just by their sheer force of will and what's Nietzsche called it, the will to power, that they just change the world, that they're different to other people. And then I started thinking about the fact that it's a word that's really changed over time. And I really wanted to go back and look at what did genius mean before the Romantics, before we had this idea of kind of bipolar bisexuals and garrets, essentially. And what did it mean to be a genius before that? What did it mean to be a genius in the 13th century? And then that takes you into a whole load of interesting questions about God and about, the idea that previous ages would have had this idea of a kind of divine gift. And then that fades away in the Industrial Revolution and secularization. And then, of course, I have long been fascinated with IQ and the birth of psychology. And you get really towards the end of the 19th century, that's when kind of academic genius studies as a discipline comes into force. And that's when you get a lot of these new tropes, right, which like the idea that madness and genius are really close together.
Right, so because you've just brilliantly sketched up the arc that the book takes, and I particularly want to come back to that point that you make about whether or not there's something really kind of right-coded about genius, that sense of individual agency. And in the chapter where you write about Edison, I was really struck by the point that the life of Thomas Edison gets sort of mobilised in opposition to the New Deal.
Yeah.
And so, but let's just sort of wind back, maybe not as far as the 13th century, but we assume that this idea has sort of been around forever because there were, great people. But then a moment's hesitation, you think, well, actually, no. When does the word enter the language? When does the concept of, you mentioned the Romantic era, is that the modern genius? When is he, and it is, let's face it, quite often a he.
It is usually
when
he,
is he born?
Well, so the Romans and the Greeks both have these various ideas of you having been kind of a spirit speaking through you, your poetic genius. And then actually I went back into the Atlantic archives and you can really see the transition. I mean, it starts around 1600, but as you say, it's very strong, the Romantics, into the 19th century. Until quite recently, you'd say someone had a particular genius, or you would talk about the genius of France or the genius of Hungary. Right? This meant that it's kind of essential spirit within it. So you would talk about people having a genius. And then at some point, and I think this is really telling, it flips to someone being a genius. And you can just see, eventually now, that meaning has completely crowded out. And I think that tells you a lot about the way that we tell stories. I think, that this is also a bit of a story about the kind of mass media and the marketplace, the switch from artists needing to find patrons to needing to sort of sell themselves in a capitalist transaction, at which point branding becomes really important, right? It's very different to be building cathedrals for, the the ruler of Flanders than it is to be an artist trying to sell paintings in the in the late 1800s.
But presumably also the idea that you could have a genius for something is connected to an assumption that maybe your gifts or your talents are given to you by God, and there would be something incredibly sort of impious in thinking I own this spirit, because actually in a more devout age you would assume that God was guiding you. And then, so does the emergence of the idea of the genius as a sort of self-contained special person track kind of secularism, the Enlightenment?
I think it really strongly does, because you're right. In the Christian tradition, the idea would have been it was dangerous for you to set yourself up, and to be arrogant in this way, and that would be something that would essentially curse you, right? That you were usurping the place of God. It was God's estate to order who should be, who should do what, and that no man should kind of move into that. So the very kind of modern idea of genius is a kind of innately secular one, because it's about making I also think it's about making demigods out of humans. It's about a way of reintroducing enchantment into the world. There's this beautiful phrase, I nearly used it for the title, but I thought no one would understand what it meant, which is from a Ralph Waldo Emerson quote, which was, "Once we saw phoenixes, now they're gone. The world is not thereby disenchanted." And it's about that idea that you used to look around and there used to be, if you're a Greek or a Roman, there's this pantheon of gods that all kind of argue with each other and do incredible things and have weird lifestyles. And then that moves then to being the saints. If you're, if you're a medieval Christian, you might have a particular saint that you worship. And then now, who do we worship? Well, we worship geniuses. We worship Taylor Swift or Elon Musk or whoever it might be.
Is there also then a class element to this? Was the assumption, if at what point does it become okay for people who aren't part of a hereditary or class-based elite to be celebrated as special? I mean, because presumably in a feudal society, you could be the most talented artisanal worker or ploughman around, but you're never going to be celebrated as great because that's not your estate in life.
Well, but there is also this thing again. If it's a God-given gift, then it's okay for the nobility to pluck you out from obscurity, and that happens to people like Friedrich Gauss, the mathematician. He comes from a completely humble family. His parents probably couldn't even read. His father was a ploughman, and he's picked up by the Duke of Saxony, and from there becomes one of the greatest mathematicians of the century. So I think there is that idea. But you're right. At some point, it becomes really toxic, because there's a chapter in the book about Francis Galton, who was the guy who he coined the word eugenics, and he had a very strict and stratified idea of humanity, in which he put in lettered classes, and he thought that this was kind of fixed, and if you came from a long line of judges, you were just of better stock. But the interesting thing about that, in order to justify that, him and people like the social scientist Louis Terman went back to the Bible, in which there is in the Old Testament, there's very much this idea that some people are naturally, the hewers of wood and the drawers of water, right? Some of the tribes of Israel are just less good than other tribes. And so that's the other thing that's also in tension, is the Christian tradition of every life has innate human worth versus what you begin to get at the end of the 19th century, which is eugenics and dysgenics. And then that tips into, IQ scores put the kind of scientific stamp on that basically you can rank all of humanity from best to worst.
Well, this is one of the things I found really fascinating, is because I think the idea of IQ is so embedded in our culture still.
Have you ever had an IQ test?
I haven't, no. And frankly, because I wouldn't want to, essentially because I would probably, for fear of being ashamed of the result.
Right,
and I think I'm probably not an idiot, but I don't really want to know. And so there is...
Can I ask, put your hand up in this audience if you've had an IQ test? I'm just really interested. Okay,
well,
so that's a reasonable amount. Okay.
Right, now shout out the score. No, don't. No, but what's interesting is, I mean, first of all, it contains the assumption that intelligence is something you can measure. It contains the assumption that intelligence, that this very specific set of things that you could call intelligence are intelligence that is worth measuring, and that the test you're doing measures it well, which, as you brilliantly demonstrate in the book, every one of those stages is, I think the technical term, complete bollocks.
Yeah, it's really tricky, because I find the politics of IQ fascinating, and it was interesting in the process of writing this book. It kind of roared back in Silicon Valley, and it is an increasingly acute question, because the state of embryo screening that we now have, because of GWAS, genetic wide association studies and things like that, if you go and do IVF and you have 6 embryos from it, they will be able to give you a pretty good idea of, this one might be higher IQ than this one. People are being asked
what could possibly go wrong?
Right, people are being asked to make what I call straightforward eugenic decisions now. You get, and they may be more subtle on that. It may be this is an A-grade embryo, right? And there's all kinds of... We don't even really know what IQ is. If you're interested in it, there's a really good podcast episode by Stuart Ritchie and Tom Chivers, The Study Show, in which one of the things they say is we might have got it all the way wrong, which is you might have a high IQ if you're just generally genetically fit if you see what I mean. Like, you might be, actually, you've got very good chromosomes, we're saying about that, but the IQ is a reflection of that, right? So it's...
This would also explain why generally people have got smarter in the crude IQ sense over time, because everyone's diet has got better, they exercise more. Generally, we'll all live longer, we're healthier than 200 years ago, and as a result, smarter.
One of the things I had no idea about was the Flynn effect, which is named after, I think, Paul Flynn, which is that in developed nations over the course of the 20th century, on average, average IQs went up by 3 points a decade. So 100 is the average IQ, but that's not it's not like, there's a weight, a measurement that's fixed. It is just, if you sampled everybody in the population and put a point in the middle, that's what 100 is in any time. But they keep having to move it because people have got smart. Unfortunately, that effect stopped in 1995 when people got the internet at home. I mean, who knows? It could have been the release of speed, but something happened in the 90s. Exactly, but something happened in the 1990s. But you're right. But the fact that like abstract thinking in developed countries versus like hunter-gatherer societies is just so much more developed. There are all kinds of things that you can do as a society to raise average IQs.
But it's interesting, isn't it, that generally the process of scientific inquiry, you have a thesis and then you test it, and the evidence base should support it. It is extraordinary that particular metric has resisted. How resilient it is, and you observe that there's a sort of social function in particular that some of the high IQ societies, Mensa being the most famous, but others, they seem to fulfill quite an important social function for people. That means that that doesn't necessarily, have to put this politely, you can be impolite, doesn't necessarily correlate to people who are successful in other areas of their life, that it's a kind of crankish dysfunction pool.
Yeah, that's very polite, yeah, very nicely dodged. There's a phrase that Victor Serebryakov, who was one of the early secretaries of Mensa, used about the stereotype of Mensa members, which was something like brain-proud, quarrelsome underachievers limited, right? And that's how he felt that people in Mensa were seen. He said it as a member of Mensa. There's another... I found this really beautiful essay by a guy called Grady Towers, who was in lots of the ultra-high IQ societies, who said that when he had surveyed people from them, the noun that they used, a kind of collective noun for people with ultra-high IQs, wasn't genius, it was outsider. And he found this, his argument was essentially, if you've got a high IQ and you grow up in a stable home and you've got high conscientiousness, all of that kind of stuff, then you just go and become a doctor or an architect or whatever it might be. You don't need to join a high IQ society. He said they were for the psychologically walking wounded, right? Which is why people get very attached to them.
I kind of identify with that, even though I haven't had an IQ test.
Oh, there we go. You can identify into Mensa. It's fine. But I went and did a test for the purposes of this book, and I found it really fascinating because they tried. One of the problems of early IQ tests was they were what they now call culture bound, right? So they would just say kind of, Well, we had an example that's still in the thing, which was like skirt is to girl as trouser is to boy, and she went, they're very traditional, and I was like, yeah, extremely heteronormative IQ test, thank you. But it also depends on you being in a culture where men wear trousers, right? These things are very, and there were loads like that in the early IQ test. They essentially assumed you were an American wasp and had all that kind of, not wasp capital letters, not a literal wasp, I should clarify. But so now it's all about shape rotation. The non-culture bound ones. Now, have you heard of this this distinction on the internet between the word cells and the shape rotators?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm already worried that this is taking us down a sort of sinister far-right meme rabbit hole, but let's do it.
It's to express the two cultures, right? The idea that there are people who are brilliant at maths and engineering and coding, whatever it is. They might not be phenomenally articulate, and there are people who do podcasts and write newspaper columns who may not be able to add up numbers, if this is making any sense. But they're essentially word cells and shape rotators. And so I felt very annoyed at having to do the shape rotator test because I'm not a shape rotator. Only my job doesn't call for it. I've managed to get through in life without going, the roundy one goes next to the triangular one. Like, that doesn't come up a lot. But it does, But
that again, that seems to connect to this sense that somewhere in there, because these distinctions always exist, and there's people talk about left brain and right brain, and I was struck that you mentioned in the book that's been pretty debunked as a meaningful distinction between personality types. I think the idea that there's sort of left brain dominance and right, or overstated. Is that fair?
I mean, I have a giant asterisk over all psychological research of the 20th century just because of the replication crisis and because of how much of it, when they tried to rerun the experiments, didn't stand up to it. And the journals of personality are incredibly prone to this. You know, one of the great personality scientists of the 20th century is also mentioned in the book, Hans Eysenck. You know, this was a guy who took money from tobacco companies and said he didn't think that smoking caused lung cancer. And that research, he also thought you could have this was his alternative explanation for it was that you could have a cancer-prone personality, right? But this is also the same thing that they had, you know, this was the same thing that's the kind of tendency that said that autism came because people's mothers were very cold to them, right? There were just lots of these woo-woo theories floating around in the ether in the second half of the 20th century.
Well, ether also being another way.
Ether being a classic example of it, yeah. And but he was also hugely influential in personality studies and IQ. And that research, no one has gone through. The King's College London has retracted a lot of his work on heart disease and smoking and cancer because that matters to the medical record, right? But there is no equivalent pressure to do the same with his work on personality. And so I caution anybody writing about any of these things just to kind of go, you know, just a big note of, you know, an asterisk of caution over lots of the subject. I should say that on the other side, the political left went too far. So there were people who were purely environmental. They thought there was no heritable component of IQ because they associated that with people who were very socially conservative and racist. And that isn't true either. But you just have to be quite humble. And unfortunately, the history of 20th century science is a series of people not being very humble.
Well, and again, I'm conscious of the fact that throughout this conversation, I think almost perhaps every person we've referenced has been a man. And the history of IQ and well, going back to your core thesis, the idea of genius, it is so male-coded. And, I mean, it's a basic question, but why?
I think a lot of it comes back to hero worship. And I think we're really reluctant to hero worship women. And I think men are particularly reluctant to hero worship women. There are a lot of men who feel, this doesn't apply to all by any means, who feel most comfortable in a kind of, this is a very knobby way of phrasing this, a homosocial lattice. That sounds like a very niche porn category, I'm aware. But when you look...
Also something that a shape rotator might have difficulty with.
Very true, actually. But you know what I mean? Like when I spend a lot of time watching the kind of Joe Rogan podcast circuit, right? And it is... Because
you are a masochist?
Because I'm a masochist, yes. And for work purposes, I should stress. But it's really interesting to me that it entirely privileges men of immense eloquence and boldly stated strong opinions. And they just all circulate around each other, creating a kind of, as I say, like lattice of expertise and influence. And they all kind of go, oh, Jordan Peterson, great thinker. And then Jordan Peterson will come on and say something complete horseshit. But it's like he's got a doctorate. Whereas like a woman who's got a doctorate, well, she was probably a DEI hire. You know, it's not real science when ladies do it. And I do think that there's a lot of that about is just about, you know, this idea that essentially when we're talking about geniuses, we're talking about hero worship. And you know, the other thing I really would stress, like having done Difficult Women as my first book, is that I think it's very easy to underestimate how hard some of these barriers were until much more recently than we might think. So the two examples that really strike me is women couldn't be members of the Royal Society until 1940-something. So that, you know, that is the place, if you're a scientist, you want to go and hear about the latest discoveries. You need to know what the cutting edge of your field is. You need to know what other people are doing. Like half of the problem of scientific research is knowing what are interesting questions to ask. And the other one that shocked me was the fact that both obviously in the Soviet Union, but also in the Ivy League, had really huge restrictions on Jewish students in the 20s and 30s. You know, they would deliberately, the New York universities, say, we want to recruit more people from the outer boroughs, which was code word for WASPs, right? The white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And that's kind of mad because they were deliberately choosing less smart students in order to achieve what they thought, you know, to kind of preserve white racial hegemony. And so I just think we have to be really open and honest about the fact that most people, working class people, black Americans, Jewish people, women, have been, you know, fighting from a long way back in the field until really recently.
But it's interesting how even sort of retrospectively, sort of great figures. So I mean, I think it's in the book you give the example of Jane Austen, who I think everyone would recognise just on the metric of how frequently is this person's work adapted for television. Definitely up there in the in the canon of great British writers, and yet somehow you'll probably articulate it better than me, occupies a space that is sort of genteel and nice, but not it's not sort of Byronic, powerful genius. Actually, I mean, an extraordinary, phenomenal writer, so much insight into society, culture, and yet somehow even then, it does. I'm guessing probably less often labelled a genius than male writers.
Yeah, I did have a big argument with a friend of mine about whether or not Jane Austen is a genius. And I think one thing she gets tagged with is this idea that she's domestic, which is coded feminine, right? Which is, she just writes about people's emotions. And you're like, that's what novelists do. That's literally how novels work.
That's what people are.
But there is like a consistent strain of criticism that she's writing amid the a war with with France, right? And yet that only ever happens on the peripheries of the novel. Or whatever it might be, or that Mansfield Park has this backdrop of slavery, but she never goes into it. The worst kind of review in the world, as anyone who's written a book will tell you, is the one of like, why didn't this book have this thing I'm interested in? And, I'm sorry, Jane Austen wrote too much about Derbyshire for you. But also it is this idea that when women write about families, it's pathetic and domestic and small. When Tolstoy writes about families, when Chekhov writes about families, then it's an insightful, look into the human condition. And that is one of the problems, is that if you look at one of the big findings of social science is that when women move into a profession, its prestige and its salary level drops. And so that's the problem, is that women, for prestige reasons, should try and compete in male-dominated fields. But if too many of them get in, they take the whole ship down with them, right? And this is what happened to computer coders who used to be majority women, and it wasn't very high stakes. Or school teachers, right? The schoolmaster, the Victorian schoolmaster was a figure of authority. Now we sort of see school teachers as glorified social workers because it's a feminised profession.
So the flip side of the sort of undervalued female writer is the assumption that the male writer has just felt this genius spirit and produced these great works, but possibly also because he had a wife who was doing all the other stuff.
I mean, the material conditions are really fascinating. I'm obsessed with Yayoi Kusama, the Japanese artist, who has long struggled with mental health issues, and in about 1970, I think, checked herself into an asylum, from which she gets up every morning and potters over to her studio, does some art, and then potters home at night. And I just think about this and I just think, wouldn't that be such a great life? It's just such a great life. But that's the life that, like a Cambridge College would have given to you, or, whatever it might have been, like a monastery would have given to you.
What do you write? There's one of my favourite chapters in the book is the one about Tolstoy, because
he's such a great monster.
I haven't read all of Tolstoy, but I've read the two really big fat ones and some of the slightly crap later ones that you
have you read the Kreutzer Sonata? That's a particularly bad one.
Right. I've read The Death of Ivan Ilyich, which actually, that's right.
You've done your time.
I've done my time with late Tolstoy. But anyway, first of all, I love his wife because her maiden name turns out to be Behr. No relation as far as I'm aware, but, who knows. But also, just we're really going down the rabbit hole. But just the fact that there could have been no Tolstoy, not the myth, not the man, not the works, without Mrs. Tolstoy.
Sophia Tolstoya. Yeah, I think their story is really interesting because I came to it and it was a good learning experience to me to not be too kind of dogmatically feminist about it, right? My assumption was, when I went in, Sophia Tolstoya, she wrote a novella called Natasha when she was really young, which Tolstoy plundered for War and Peace. She copied out all his works for him endlessly. And above all, Anne Wilson says that she was his reader. And they had that symbiotic relationship of kind of writer and muse where he wanted to write for her to impress her, and she kind of poured out her life story to him. At the same time, she was really miserable. I mean, he was a Russian patriarch of the 19th century. His word was absolute law. He was an aristocrat. So he suddenly would go like, I want to go to Mongolia where we're all going to live in a yurt and drink yak's milk. And like the whole, him and the 19 kids would troop off to Mongolia for it. Or he'd suddenly announce he was vegetarian or whatever it might be. But the thing that's really fascinating about Sophia Tolstoy's story, she left these diaries that constantly say, I've subsumed myself to him. It's a horror to be married to a genius. But then this young guy called Vladimir Chertkov tips up slightly past Tolstoy's creative peak and essentially usurps her. And that's when you get this kind of weird semi-religious cult around Tolstoy, the Tolstoyans, and edges her out. And as you say, that's the point when he starts writing the books that are harder to read, and like now he thinks that Shakespeare was rubbish, and like he's coming out with all this kind of stuff, and you can kind of see that he I wouldn't say that she's the sort of secret wife that did all the work, but like the works that are brilliant are the product of him in sort of symbiosis with a female consciousness, and when he loses that, the work loses something. And then the second thing is that although she was bloody miserable when she was being dragged around, being able to, having just given birth, copying out War and Peace for the 8th time, she was also bloody miserable when that ended. And that to me was one of the most interesting things to think about. And you mentioned masochism before, because often there is a certain masochism from everybody around the genius. Like Picasso is another really good example of this. The people around him were living miserable lives. There's a whole spate of suicides and, people...
Was it in him the metaphors of the vampire is used? This idea of people sort of sucking the essence out of the people around them.
Yeah, Marina Picasso, his granddaughter, wrote he needed blood to work. My blood, my mother's blood. Brancusi called him a vampire. And he was this sort of tiny little Breton-clad tyrant in the middle, everybody orbited around him. And as he became more and more famous and more rich, more iconic, everybody wanted to keep that show on the road, and they enabled him. But people could have left, and so many people around, and I think this is true also of Silicon Valley startups, right? You hear these people living these miserable lives. If you've ever read the book about Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter, and he comes in and says, everyone's going to have to sleep in sleeping bags on the floor because we're extremely hardcore.
And the people talk about him, and it is a bit the way they talk about a cult leader. Yeah. There's that sense, that sort of charismatic magnetism that makes people really degrade themselves to be around him.
And geniuses are like cult leaders, often, actually, in the way that they operate. So people will say, the relationship between bad behaviour and geniuses, how does that work? And I kind of feel that sometimes, actually, the more someone is bad and odd and weird, the more we're inclined to call them a genius, where someone of equivalent achievements who was a boring bourgeois normie kind of doesn't, we want geniuses to be strange.
He's not in the book, but because you mentioned Chekhov earlier, I think he slightly falls into that trap a bit. He was a bit, Dostoevsky was an absolute piece of work, whereas Chekhov kind of, not so much as far as I'm aware. And as a result, he doesn't quite occupy that space of the tortured genius. But, and you have that great George Bernard Shaw quote, which I could probably fish out if I have the time, but we'll maybe.
Oh, the one about the man should impoverish his family and leave his wife, whatever.
The proper artist basically destroys everyone around him because all he's thinking about is his art. And I wonder if it's so deep in in our culture, the idea that's the test. But I would say even I intuitively think probably true in that there must be a level of single-mindedness of purpose that for those of us who do actually try and spend some time with their children or walk the dog or whatever the hell it is, or maybe it's that we like to tell ourselves that because that's my reason for not having written War and Peace, right? Because I'm too busy being a good parent, rather than I just couldn't write War and Peace even if I tried.
Yeah, I nobly decided to sacrifice writing War and Peace so that my children would like me. Yeah, I think there is something to that. But I also... I think that in the category of genius also is a kind of envy shield. Is if you just believe that some people, whether it's because they've got a high IQ or they were chosen by God, are just kind of, it's like walking with dinosaurs. They're just different to the rest of us. That is a quite protective mechanism for you feeling small and inadequate, right? You just could never have done it. But I do also come back to the fact that I think we attach the genius label to big lives. Like you mentioned Jane Austen. The thing I meant to say was Havelock Ellis, great sexologist and social scientist of the early 20th century, tried to do a list of British geniuses, one of those cursed projects. And one of his criteria was how many pages did you get in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography? And so he had to exclude Jane Austen, because Jane Austen's biography is like, was born, lived in rectory, wrote books, died. And then, it just doesn't... there was just not the material there. And I just thought that spoke to me about the fundamental confusion of this category. Is it about the work or is it about the life?
Right. In the same way that if you die tragically young, or you have a very, very long sort of senescence where you get to curate your own myth. The worst thing you could do is kind of reach middle age and then just accidentally,
putter out on the golf course. Yeah, no, it's a worry. Yeah, so basically, if you go before 30, it's bittersweet. So many genius stories are bittersweet. So if you go before 30, it's what we could have had. It's Jeff Buckley, it's Amy Winehouse. It's some of the romantic poets. Like Keats, whatever. Schubert. Yeah, right. It's just Mozart. And also so many, because genius is this human category as well. So much of it is that there's never enough of it. Like, what's our myth about Leonardo da Vinci? There's just not enough of it has survived. This
is why Paul McCartney had to work so hard to get back up to the place that John Lennon was at by having died in 1980. Because you had the whole frog song thing, and it was like that really. It was not good for the brand,
right? And people,
but also,
but people keep asking me about, I was wondering how to say this in the book without it sounding mean and glib, but to some extent, the right Beatle died, and I don't mean to be rude, but I just think honestly, if John Lennon was still alive, essentially he would be like John Cleese, right? He would just be slightly reactionary and giving he would just be out there going, "Oh, say Taylor Swift isn't a patch on us," and you just think, don't cheapen it, John. We all like the long and winding road. You're ruining it for everyone.
That was a Paul song.
Okay, well, fine. Sorry, never question a middle-aged man's knowledge of Beatles. What was I thinking? We're doing yeah. World War II beach landing soon. Anyway, but will not be beaten. But the
Italian landing was one. Anyway.
Yeah, right. But you take my point, which is that the Beatles, in a way, and I have this a couple of chapters on the Beatles. It's astonishing that they had one of each. So Paul has gone on and become kind of father of the nation, and has lived with his mythology incredibly graciously. Like, people do not feel let down when they meet Paul McCartney. He just has lived with that level of celebrity really well. But at the same time, there can be no more Beatles songs. And, they had an incredibly prolific, amazing short burst. And then they didn't cheapen it. And Craig Brown says this to me, and he compares them to the Rolling Stones, and he just said, the Stones just kind of went on and on. And it doesn't feel as moving and as affecting as it does when you watch that Glastonbury performance of McCartney with the voice of John Lennon tapped in from 30, 40 years ago.
But also, and in that Beatles chapter, you captured very well the fact that they didn't just land from space as the Beatles. They put in the hours working really hard in Hamburg, but also they had Brian Epstein. They had a whole. There was used this word "senius."
Yeah.
Which is that your coinage or is that?
No, it's Brian Eno's word. And I had thought about having this chapter and calling it like the 50th Beatle, because there are just and actually brilliantly, Stuart McConey's done a book that's called "With a Little Help from Their Friends," which is about this exact thing. There's a brilliant podcast series called "Producing the Beatles." It's all about George Martin.
Endorse. Very good podcast.
It is really, really good. And the thing I find fascinating is that, the kind of hostile reactions I've had to this book are people thinking it's a kind of debunking. It's like, you're saying that all of these great men that we like were kind of rubbish, really. And I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the Beatles were incredible, but by God, they were lucky to find George Martin. And they were smart to go, because they picked him because he was a comedy producer, right? They thought he would have,
because they loved the Goon Show.
They loved the Goon Show. They thought, but he introduced them to, these guys who'd never learned to read music. He introduced them to Counterpoint and all of this kind of stuff that all this technical musical knowledge they just hoovered up. And I think that's, and the same thing is true of Austen. Austen is now presented, she has now become just the tea towel version of female novelist for the time, as if she emerged fully formed from nowhere. And that's written Frances Burney out of the story, or Della Riviere Manley, or Mary Hayes, or any number of Maria Edgeworth. She was working within a kind of set of people and references. And actually, we have lost a little bit of something by the fact that she is so much in the foreground, the iconic brand. And we've lost all of the when I used to talk to Rob, as I say, who I talked about this book a lot with, he would describe it as the genius is like a painting. And the problem is, by bringing the figure to the foreground, what's all the stuff that's being pushed into the background?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it does make me think that... so you had the sort of Merseybeat scene, you have a sort of milieu, different people come from different, in different historical times and places, you get that kind of bubbling up of something creative happening. You mentioned in relation to Silicon Valley that there is a certain coalescence of forces that come together to make something happen. And I wonder whether in the sort of digital era that's going to or maybe already has, really changed the nature of the way an individual can emerge? What would a scene look like in that sort of digital environment?
Yeah,
What's a digital genius?
No, I think it's really sad. I mean, like, I think we have denied ourselves many artistic and scientific geniuses through high house prices. And I know I can turn everything into a rant about high house prices, but I think this is really true. There was some very good research about the effect of prohibition on patent applications in American counties. And so you have a natural experiment where some counties in America banned alcohol and therefore bars, and others didn't. And sure enough, the ones that don't have bars at the time had fewer patent applications. And so there is a point to having that third space that is not your work and not your home, than which you discuss ideas and you chuck them around. And again, this speaks to the fact of women's exclusion, right? If you have those, again, the Royal Society is a sort of version of that. If you have a space in which you can just chuck ideas around, that is really important to innovation. And what we've ended up, we used to have, when Picasso was living in Montmartre in Paris, he was living in a drafty warehouse and having a kind of glass of wine and paying a couple of sous for that rent. You couldn't live there now if you're an artist. That's gone. That's all gone.
I suppose that also connects back to this sense that you have to suffer for your art, isn't it? There's a sense that somehow if it shouldn't be, if it's effortless and easy, or you have too comfortable a life, you haven't. We need there to be some sort of martyrdom involved before for the genius spirit to be sort of authentic.
Yeah, but that, I think struggle gives meaning. Think about the fact that if people, they did an experiment with AI written poetry in which they showed it to people, and people liked AI written poetry because it's kind of generically poetish. But when they were told that it was by AI, their scores dramatically dropped, because suddenly now you feel cheated. And I feel the same, like there's been lots of controversies about like wildlife photos and whether or not they're being generated by AI. Fundamentally, we want something to have, think about all the Oscar campaigns that revolve around we shot this in natural light, or Tom Cruise only ate one apple for a year, or like whatever it might be, Charlize Theron made herself ugly. We want it to cost people something.
Well, I love your phrase is sort of the deficit model of genius, that sense that somehow, again, it's sort of, but also it's that your point about being insulated from envy as well. It sort of compensates us a little bit of thinking, well, if to be a Nobel laureate, you also have to sort of be in a wheelchair, or if to be a genius, you have to also be spend time in an asylum or cut your ear off, then I can feel a bit better about not having got that Nobel Prize and not having painted that masterpiece.
And that is a very post-romantic idea. Rembrandt didn't. He was just knocking out nice paintings for Flanders nobles. No one expected him to be miserable about it. But you really, and I think Van Gogh is one of the prime exponents of, or rather the mythology of Van Gogh that his sister-in-law, Johanna van Gogh Bonga, creates around him. It just, because it fits so well with the form of the paintings, right? The paintings with the swirling brushstrokes, they look like somebody who is constantly in motion, who's restless. So she came up with the perfect life to help people understand what the emotion they felt when they looked at the art. And I think that stuff is incredibly important. The deficit model, I think, is essentially how all biopics of genius work. And there's a terrible one from the 1990s about someone.
I'll just interrupt you to say if it's worth getting the book, just to read the takedown of some of the really bad biopics that have been made over the years.
Well, they're just, some of them are a bit paint by numbers. But there's a one there's something like, it's called Dark Genius or something from 1990, and the tagline for it is basically the tagline of every biopic you'll ever watch about a genius. So if you go home and never watch one, think about this, and it's, he's seriously gifted and seriously twisted. And it's I used to work at the Daily Mail, and we always had a Saturday when we always used to do an obituary. Every time we would say that basically the Daily Mail headline on any obituary was always genius or pervert. And usually they were both, which was very happy. But like, there is a thing, if you watch A Beautiful Mind, which is about John Nash, of Nash's Equilibrium, who has also suffered from schizophrenia and heard voices and had hallucinations. There's The Imitation Game with Alan Turing, and his kind of neurodivergence and homosexuality are presented as things that put him on the outside. He's presented as being like a computer himself, so of course he's the guy who ushered in the computer age. And then, as you said, The Theory of Everything, with Stephen Hawking. And they have to bend reality to fit these patterns, because it's very awkward that actually Hawking's really best work was done before the ALS progressed. But the thing that is, I think, very moving to all of us is exactly that triumph of the human spirit, which is the idea that somebody's got this brilliant brain and they're trapped inside this body that is not allowing them to use that brain. That's the bit that emotionally connects with us. And so I think Hawking ended up with a kind of celebrity that someone like Roger Penrose, an equally brilliant physicist, never got, because there was nothing there that sort of touched you about how difficult this was, how, the cost of this, the cruelty of this, that was just emotionally moving.
Now, you mentioned the Turing case and this idea of the fact that he's presented as having this mechanistic, mechanical mind that made him more in tune with the machines, and that reminded me of towards the end of the book, the chapter where you write about Silicon Valley, you write very well about Musk, and you sort of finally arrived at answering a question that I'd had in the back of my mind all the way through the book, which is, are you at some stage going to talk about autism spectrum disorder? Because all the other characters all the way through, I've been reading about them thinking, that's sounding a little bit autism spectrum. Are we going to get to that question, Helen? And then you got there. And it's a really interesting point, particularly in relation to Musk, but more widely, whether there is sort of genius and neurodivergence. There's a Venn diagram to be drawn there somewhere, isn't there? Yeah,
and I think it's really interesting, because if you look at somebody like Isaac Newton, fairly obviously he was neurodivergent in some way, but so are a lot of people, right? The question is to what extent does it occur more often in geniuses, or is this just something that's found within the population, but we notice it because, again, it's a bittersweet story. And the classic kind of scatty professor story is, oh, he's absolutely amazing at physics, but he can't remember to tie his shoelaces, right? That appeals to us in some way, the idea that there's kind of a credit in the ledger and a debit in the ledger. But you're right, I wanted to be very cautious writing about autism, because I think it's still a very nebulous diagnosis, right? I think the autism spectrum is kind of in some ways unhelpful to go from kids who are really non-verbal, really struggling, all the way through to what would have once been called Asperger's, basically high-functioning people who, maybe struggle in social situations, whatever it might be. That's a big old range to make generalizations about, so I was quite cautious about it. But there is definitely something, and I think Steve Silverman brought this out in his book, Neurotribes, about the way that Silicon Valley valorizes autism. And again, it's that idea of you work with computers, you're a coder. Actually, there's a sort of feeling that you should have a brain like a machine. There was a famous thing that someone said about OpenAI recently, about the fact that it had all gone a bit conventional. And they said, everyone who can make eye contact at AI joined within the last 6 months. And it was this sort of huffy little thing of like, we used to have proper engineers, with autism, and now we have salespeople. And I just thought that was really, really fascinating to me, that there is, and again, I think it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? That you would celebrate the fact that people can accomplish great things while not being normal or ordinary or whatever it might be, and being maybe different and difficult. But yeah, the thing I think is a bit tricky is is Elon Musk neurodivergent, or is he just rude? Is an open question, I would say. Speaking of questions, I've just clocked the time, and we've been yabbering away, and I bet there are lots of questions out there.
My brother and my cousins, who were born in the 70s, 80s and 90s, and when one of us lost, we would blame the others for having more lead exposure than the others.
Right.
Do you think that there is any truth to that, and what might be the next lead exposure?
So, for anyone who didn't catch, this is this very interesting, I think relatively well-supported theory that actually criminality, particularly in the US, was influenced by lead exposure in early childhood and heavy metal buildup in the brain. The FT actually has done some really quite alarming work on lead pipes degenerating. So I think my assessment of that evidence is that it's definitely worth looking into. There was a bit of a kind of... There has always been... Cyril Burt, who I write about in the book, wrote a book about the delinquent child. There has been a kind of constant search for the kind of, the origins of the delinquent child in various ages. So, again, approach with caution, but I think it does seem relatively well established. But if you ask me what the lead of now is there going to be any disagreement from anyone in this room if I say, I think it's doom scrolling, isn't it? Out of my, my own experiences, I remember you saying this to me once, actually, when we worked together at the New Statesman. You said you'd taken some time off Twitter, and you said, and it was amazing, I had a long, continuous thought for maybe, 30 seconds at a time.
Well, no, I mean, I've practiced quite intense digital hygiene, especially when I go on holiday, because the condition of being on holiday is increasingly about being off the digital space. And it's exactly that sensation. What you notice, two things I notice, actually. One is, if I put my phone away, after about a day, I feel a certain restlessness that it exactly mimics the sensation I had when I gave up smoking. There's that thing, there should be something in my hand, it's not right. Why do I have this fizzy restlessness? And the other one is that sense I'm aware of a train of thought leaving the station and going a few stops down the line before being derailed by me getting my phone out and thinking, what am I afraid of thinking? What is the anxiety about where my mind might take me that I feel a need to always derail the train of thought? And cognitively, what is that doing to me? And I guess probably making me a bit stupider.
I mean, and it may be not even be stupid. You might just be... I mean, your brain is very plastic, right? It just responds in adaptation of stimuli incredibly well. And obviously, as you get older, it becomes harder for it to do that. If you're a baby, you can, prune those neurons. But one of the things that I think we might be better at doing now is just taking in lots of information incredibly quickly and just processing it. But what we're less good at doing is sitting down and, as you say, having that thought that takes you to the end of the station. And yeah, I really, I don't have a kid, so I'm in the luxurious position of not having to enact this in the face of screams and tantrums. But I would be incredibly reluctant to give any toddler an iPad, anything like that. And I would be incredibly... I think the school phone bans that are coming in are incredibly good. It's fascinating to watch just how, like you say, how antsy you get. And I personally have been locked in a great struggle to read books again. Remember books? They were great, weren't they? But just the idea that you might... Yeah, thank you very much. But that you might take in information at a slightly slower pace. And here's the bit that I think you're right. Your line exactly about what are you afraid of kind of thinking. The idea that you sit with a book and you have your own thoughts around the process of reading it, right? Rather than constantly like drinking from the fire hose of slurry directly into your eyes without a moment of pause between them is a really important thing for intelligence in the human brain to do. Ezra Klein said this recently. I thought it was really important about the fact that people say, oh, it's amazing, ChatGPT can summarize things for you. Summaries are really bad. What you need to do, and I say this, what you need to do is sit down with a book and spend 8 hours having the experience of reading that book and having your own thoughts around it. You could read an A4-page summary of my book. It's not going to give you the same experience of you thinking, oh, that's really interesting, because that reminds me of that thing that I read somewhere else, and making your own connections to it. And we've created this hyper-optimized society where that's what intelligence looks like. But it's pin shallow, I think. And I say this as somebody who does a lot of podcasts. You can just get away with incredible shallow. We have got this problem where people just say glib shit, and they don't really know anything about anything. I mean, that is most podcasts. And I say this as we've done podcasts. We're not excluding ourselves from this.
Thank you. Was there any geniuses that you liked that you'd not heard of?
Who do I rate? I love the novels of Jane Austen. I think they're beautiful. My comfort read is to go back and read Pride and Prejudice. So I will rescue her from my room 101. But I also felt very strongly that it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. If you like the work or you enjoy using the technology, that's kind of okay. I think... I wrote this piece a while ago when J.K. Rowling first came out as Gender Criticals, and all the people on Muggle.net were kind of tearing and rending their garments and saying, she will never say her name again. Of saying, this reminds me a lot of, because she's a children's author, I think this is particularly acute, of the way that you have a realisation at the age of like 12 or 13 or whatever it might be, that your parents are sort of human beings. They're not these godlike figures of your childhood. Oh, no, they do things that are small and petty. Then you get to an adult and you realise that your parents are heroes and that they put up with an awful lot from you. But, I do think you have to go through that process. Again, hero worship is a really dangerous phenomenon, and I don't need to hero worship Van Gogh in order to love the things about his work that I love. I don't need that anymore as an adult.
I'm glad you raised that, because this is something I always find fascinating about this question of the ethics of consuming or appreciating art by people who you don't like. And I think at some level there is an awkward boundary of like, if it's good enough, it's okay? So sort of, or is it that like you can like the early Michael Jackson more, or is it like because he was still a kid and but also it's better, and I don't or is it like Wagner was so good that you don't really mind all the terrible attitudes, but Gary Glitter, well, he is disposable, so Well, it's not a clear line, is it?
No, I think that's a real problem. I had this exact problem when Kanye West released that Heil Hitler song, and I was like, that's a banger. but I'm against it. But yeah, I think there is and there's also a kind of statute of limitations, right? Which is like Caravaggio murdered someone, but it was whenever, it was the Renaissance, no harm, no foul. I think the problem with it comes in the fact that, and this is particularly acute in a social media age, is that your declaration that you like something is a badge that you put on yourself to wear, that you presume says something about you. So you get in these situations where people feel that they have to defend liking something, or liking some bits of somebody and not other ones of them. And that they feel very defensive about any kind of criticism of that because they feel it reflects badly on them. What kind of person would like, when someone gets kind of Me Too'd, what kind of person would like someone who could do something like that? Well, most people have good attributes and bad attributes. And there is a chapter about the kind of these tortured geniuses, which is, I think I fought very hard for it to get in the book, against quite some resistance. It's about a theatre director who was outed for having looked at child sex abuse images and killed himself. But he had a kind of coterie of people around him who would have said that they were incredibly socially progressive, incredibly cared about morals and ethics, and yet they all came to the realisation that they had kind of signed off on this very obviously pervy behaviour for a number of years, which I thought was really brave of them to admit, actually. But it really spoke to that idea that people just suppress. They don't want to like flawed heroes.
Yeah, I thought that chapter worked really well because it wasn't someone I'd heard of, and so it captured that sense of, well, in a small milieu, the cult figure who persuades enough people around him that he's a genius. Doesn't matter if he doesn't enter the canon as a genius. Yeah. The aura of genius actually exists at that micro level. I thought that was an important contribution to the book.
And you also see it in the kind of fraudsters and con men thing, right? So I didn't end up writing about them, but I could easily have written about Elizabeth Holmes of Theranos, the blood company that turned out to be a complete scam, who basically did Steve Jobs cosplay, right? She bought a black roll neck and she deepened her voice to sound more serious. But she knew what people thought an innovator looked like in Silicon Valley, and she just bought the costume off the shelf. Then, Sam Bankman-Fried and his collapsed crypto empire sort of bought a kind of, young Turk whiz kid / Boris Johnson costume off the shelf, right? Like, oh, look at me, I've got messy hair. That means I'm a genius. And actually what it meant was that he messed up his hair, much like Boris Johnson, deliberately in order to kind of have a more saleable persona. So I think it's really important. As you say, one of the reasons I fought for that chapter is exactly because you don't have to be Picasso to be able to use the tropes that we have of genius. The work doesn't actually sometimes have to be that good for you to be able to get that kind of cult following.
What do you make of the academic research that suggests the intelligence distribution is different for men and women, that on average they have similar levels of intelligence, but at the margins and the extremes, the most stupid people are men and the very, very cleverest people are men, and women cluster around the middle a bit more? What do you think of that?
Yeah, that's the so-called variability hypothesis of intelligence. And I think there is reasonable evidence for it. I just don't... The way that it's wielded is essentially to say, well, the only reason that women ever succeed is through kind of, affirmative action. And I think the problem with that is that it makes that mistake of thinking that there is such a thing as a genius-level IQ. I can point you to lots of people who have an IQ technically of 180 who have not achieved anything with their lives. So what are we really saying with that distribution? Yeah, I mean, so I think you have to be very careful about acknowledging that there are sex differences, but not over-interpreting them to, that kind of just complacency of saying, well, that's how the world is, and these things just are innate and they explain them. I would always put, again, like a level of humility around that. But that Camille Paglia was big into that. And her example is hilarious. She says, we have a Mozart for the same reason we have Jack the Ripper. And you go, wait, are those... Like, which way, Western man? Like, do you want to compose amazing sonatas or do you want to murder people in the East End? Those are your two choices if you're a man. Whereas women, we're just boring. We don't do any composing or any murdering.
Hi, yeah. I just had a quick one, which was, where do you see the role of the genius moving as we move into a landscape with more AI?
It's a really good question, and I think it... So I think one of the reasons that AI companies have maybe struggled a bit is because they've been searching after G, this elusive quality, general intelligence, and maybe that's something that there's been a great deal of debate over. And what we've ended up is LLMs, large language models, being the most promising frontier of that. But again, it's very easy to be fooled by LLMs, right? And again, this comes back to my problem with podcasts. Someone saying smart things, it can often sometimes be very superficial. And you can see that with all the sad stories of people who've come to kind of AI psychosis, which I was talking to someone who works in one of the big AI companies last week. They are taken quite seriously, right? That is not just a media moral panic. It does seem to be that there is a small but significant number of people who cannot handle the fact there isn't a real person behind the thing that talks and sounds like a human being. So I think there's some of that. I also think it's a fundamental misunderstanding that if you could get an AI to generate an infinite number of Van Gogh paintings, people would like that. Again, it's the fact it means something. I think it's John Berger talked about the kind of aura of a painting, right? The idea that you can go to a gallery and that's the exact paint stroke that Monet touched is meaningful. And if you could churn that out by the yard, it's Muzak. It doesn't mean anything anymore. So I think again, the genius myth explains why we will still have these figures in an age of AI, because actually what we want is a human connection. We want to think there was another mind that did this, and if we find out there isn't, we feel kind of cheated, actually, by it.
Do you think that just makes you think, I mean, are we, because you start the book, or early in the book, you start with obvious candidate, Shakespeare, clear genius, no one's going to argue, and then we sort of go through time, the Romantic era, and then I wonder if, just listening to what you were saying there, we hit the sort of the 20th century and Einstein is this very sort of iconic figure, and then you get into technology, and there's almost like we're at peak tech sort of science as genius model, and then we're going to get into this era of AI, and it's going to really illuminate what it is about empathy and human connection and all the other things that we can actually be confident that machines are going to be really shit at, like being kind and funny and humane, and suddenly we'll go back to a different notion of genius, which isn't so much about science and technology. Yeah, the fact that so Monet, the painterly genius or whatever it is, we're kind of going to come out the other side of a very mechanistic, intelligence-based idea of it.
I think that's really interesting because you're right. I mean, I end with the tech genius as the kind of template that has been around since the second half of the 20th century and shows no sign of dropping. I think AI is a particularly interesting example because, again, it speaks to some of these themes about kind of divinity. It's really fascinating to me that you will hear people talk about AI as if they are kind of creating God. And my suspicion is that that's often marketing, but I do think there are people genuinely within that space who feel that they've had some kind of revelation, that they've seen in some kind of greater consciousness. I did try and think, where do I think it's going next? And I'd be interested to hear anyone else's theories, because I don't have a good example. It feels like that one's running out of road. I mean, the reason I ended the book with Elon Musk is that I felt like Doge was going to go badly. And then he embarked on a sort of huge press tour for the book by completely spannering it. But that was a very good example to me of the limits of that myth, which was like, well, let's just get 12 awesome coders in and then suddenly we'll solve the US government. And Sam Altman of OpenAI said something mad to me a couple of months ago when he was like, we know we haven't got to artificial general intelligence yet because we still have disease. And I thought, what? And it was really fascinating to me that he was presenting public health as an engineering challenge when it's a political challenge, right? You and I have lived through any number of very good government ideas that for some reason that they haven't been able to communicate to people. Or like Dominic Cummings being a very good example, people who've got some ideas that aren't necessarily good and they simply cannot get on with anyone that they work with. And so they don't get things done. And it just struck me that this was a very good example now that we're butting up against the limits of the tech genius idea, the idea that every problem is a tech problem, is actually, I think our politics really, really debunks that, right?
Yeah, and what I think I really appreciated at the end of the book, and which is where we started this conversation, that you open up the prospect of rehabilitating the idea that genius can be an event or a mood or something that almost sort of passes through you. You can have a moment of genius without having to be a genius. And if we could sort of retire the idea that the self-contained human being is the embodiment of genius, but then it becomes something that, if we're lucky, every now and again we can access ourselves.
Right. You can say that you can say that Billie Jean is an act of genius without having to really co-sign off like the hero worship of Michael Jackson. I think that's probably just a healthier way to look at it.
I think we're out of time there on that fantastic musical note. I'm not going to